Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Howell, a member of TESOL Italy's Executive Committee, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of the TESOL Italy 48th Convention. Certificates of attendance will be available to download from the convention page of the TESOL Italy website after the convention. And our speaker for this session is Michael Ennis. Michael Ennis is the Scientific and Didactic Coordinator for the English language at the Language Centre of the Free University of Bolzano. He is Vice President of TESOL Italy and also serves TESOL International as the Chair of the ESP Interest Section, member of the Conference's Professional Council. The title of Mike's session is Culture General Teaching in Academic Writing Courses for PhD Students. Mike, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Can you see my slides now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. There we go. So thank you very much, Sarah. So I'm going to jump right into it. Sarah has already introduced me and already introduced my title, so I'll jump right into my presentation. So I'd like to start by defining a few key terms to frame this approach that I'm talking about. So first of all, English for academic purposes. This is best defined as a branch of ESP, which prepares learners for real-world communication in academic contexts. Oftentimes, we distinguish between general academic purposes, EGAP, versus specific academic purposes, ESAP. Another key concept in English for academic purposes is the concept of discipline. This is a specific field of study or a scientific community, sort of the target field that you may be dealing with. Another key term is specialized discourse. So each discipline belongs to a discourse community, and that discourse community has shared conventions of communication. And the ways of communicating, the language that's used within that discourse can be identified with specific linguistic features at all levels of analysis, ranging from lexis to morphology to syntax, semantics, pragmatics, etc. Another important term is jargon. So the field-specific lexis, which has a special meaning among experts. So sometimes there are words that have a common meaning among everyone, but then among experts, they have specific meanings. And then sometimes there are terms that are only used within specific fields to refer to specific concepts. Another very important concept in EAP is the concept of genre. This refers to all texts, whether written or spoken, and the idea that they follow unwritten rules, conventions, which readers come to expect, and which then over time facilitate communication based on these expectations. And genre can also be analyzed in terms of its rhetorical structure or move analysis, the idea that the information that's being presented in any sort of text follows an expected structure and an expected pattern. It's also important to define what I mean by culture in this context. So I am adopting an anthropological definition of culture, whereby we distinguish between subjective culture and material culture. Material culture would be all of the sort of physical manifestations of culture that we see in the real world, such as architecture, works of art, anything that is material, anything that can become an artifact is material culture. But subjective culture is more about the subjective reality of individuals and groups of people. And material culture can be a window into subjective culture. It can give us an idea of what's going on in subjective reality, but actual culture, subjective culture, is more elusive to us. Culture, within this definition, culture could be considered shared knowledge, beliefs, conventions, and values acquired via social interaction and acculturation over time. So from birth onwards. It's important to remember that no one belongs to just one culture. We cannot overgeneralize because individuals are different. In addition, we participate in many cultures at the same time, but all of the cultures that we participate in contribute to our personal and cultural identities. So it's sort of a double-edged sword in that sense, that we don't belong to one just culture. You can't label someone as just being an American, or just being a man or a woman, or belonging to a particular group that you can identify. We belong to many different cultures simultaneously. From this perspective, we could say that each academic discipline has its own culture. We have each academic discipline has its own language, its own conventions of communication, its own shared knowledge and beliefs and conventions that have been acquired through sort of acculturation within that academic discipline. Another concept to consider here is intercultural communication, to define what intercultural communication is. This could be seen as being a phenomenon in the world or as a field of study. It is both simultaneously. So as a phenomenon, it is any form of social interaction involving people from different cultural backgrounds. So anytime you have two or more people together who are interacting, but they come from different cultural backgrounds, they have different cultural frameworks, that would be considered a context of intercultural communication. As a field of study, the idea is that we're trying to understand and explain this phenomenon, understand and explain what is going on with intercultural communication, understanding and explaining critical incidents, so miscommunications and instances of conflict that arise because of cultural differences, understanding and explaining successful cross-cultural communication, understanding and explaining how to avoid and manage miscommunication and conflicts, defining what intercultural competence is, that is the ability to communicate across cultures and to avoid and manage miscommunication. And then finally, training learners how to become more interculturally competent themselves. Two important ideas in the field of intercultural communication are high context versus low context. And these are very important when we're talking about English for academic purposes. A high context situation is one where there are shared conventions and values, implying that meaning can be negotiated with the aid of cultural knowledge and subtle contextual cues. So language is a little bit less important because you have all these contextual cues that are easily understood by the participants in the interaction. A low context situation, on the other hand, is a situation in which there is little to no shared cultural frame from which to interpret intentions and cues. So it's more difficult to negotiate meaning without the use of language. So in high context situations, spoken and written language can be or can seem quite vague and implicit, even when communication is successful. So the extreme example of this comes from the anthropologist Edward T. Hall, who in the 1950s, in the immediate post-war era, was living in Japan and quickly recognized that Japanese were able to communicate with each other using very little language, and things were understood from the context without using language. Whereas he, an American living in Japan, quite proficient in Japanese at that point, didn't understand many things because he was relying solely on the language. And so he came up with this idea of high context versus low context cultures and situations. In low context situations, spoken and written language must be clear and explicit, or misunderstandings and potentially conflicts can arise. So language becomes more important in low context situations. Intercultural language teaching and learning. So this is the idea of bringing together something like EAP, some approach or methodology to language, and this idea of intercultural communication and intercultural training. So it's the idea of integrating intercultural learning and intercultural education in language learning and language education. It's not just about developing linguistic knowledge and awareness and communicative competence. It's also about developing cultural knowledge and awareness and becoming more interculturally competent in your interactions with speakers of the target language and all other languages. Many models have been proposed and critiqued over the years, but generally speaking, the definition that I like the most is the idea of teaching from an intercultural perspective. The intercultural language teaching is any context in which you're purposefully teaching from an intercultural perspective, implying it cannot be reduced to some sort of methodological prescription. There is no right or wrong way of doing it. There's no this worked in my context, therefore it should work in your context. It's an ecological activity borrowing from many fields of study, many fields of practice, And it involves a dialogic relationship between theory and practice, between teaching and learning, and between teacher and student. It's continuously renegotiated in each context. So to engage in intercultural language in teaching and learning, you have to develop it from the bottom up within your specific context. Not saying that you can't borrow ideas and inspiration from other contexts. And then getting to the heart of of my presentation today. Important here, anytime you're dealing with intercultural training or intercultural language teaching, we tend to differentiate between culture general versus culture specific training and education, and culture general and culture specific learning. So culture-specific teaching and learning involves learning about the culture of a target linguistic community and learning how to communicate with them more effectively. So an example would be a student is going on a study abroad program in the United Kingdom. It's their first experience outside of Italy, for example, and in the process of improving their language skills to go on the study abroad experience, they also learn about cultural customs and conventions in the UK that may assist them in communicating with so-called native speakers of the language in the United Kingdom. Cultural general learning, on the other hand, is learning about cultural differences in general. It's about becoming more tolerant of ambiguity, more tolerant of differences, and learning how to communicate across all cultures. And so this involves a different process, and it has different goals as well. Culture general teaching is compatible with the non-essentialist view of culture, this idea that culture is not monolithic. We don't belong to one culture, we belong to many cultures. We have to treat people as individuals. In some respects, every individual has their own culture because we have our own distinct cultural frames. And so it's about learning how to deal with culture in any of its manifestations. Cultural general teaching is also compatible with ELF, with English as a lingua franca. And this, of course, makes sense because in those contexts, you're typically dealing with people from many different countries and different linguistic communities. And so building upon this idea of ELF, English, of course, is the lingua franca of academia, whether we like that or not. Most learners and users of English in the world are non-native speakers of English. We know this from many sources. English does not belong to native speakers. It doesn't belong to people like me who come from an English-dominant country and grew up with English as their mother tongue. But it belongs to all users. ELF, English as a lingua franca, has rules and norms of its own that are distinct from American English, British English, and all of these other national varieties. Most interactions in English are between speakers of different languages. So most interactions don't even involve these so-called native speakers. They involve speakers of other languages who are using English properly as a lingua franca to communicate with one another. And English, for good or ill, has arisen as the global lingua franca of academia, whether we like that or not. And of course, that's because it enables communication. It's become part of world heritage as opposed to belonging to any nationality. But at the same time, it comes with it epistemological considerations and post-colonial considerations. ELF, by definition, implies cross-linguistic and cross-cultural communication and is therefore low context. So if we're dealing in an ELF context, if we're communicating in an ELF context, by definition, it would be low context because people are bringing different cultural frames. However, in the case of EAP, in particular, if you're looking at particular disciplines, there's a contradiction here because the disciplines are also high context, as we established before. So given all of that sort of background information, I'll tell you a little bit about my context based on multiple years of needs analyses. So I teach, one of the courses I teach is academic English for PhD students. My students speak different L1s. Most of them speak German or Italian in similar proportions. There are speakers of other languages in the mix as well because they're in PhD programs, and those programs are also internationalized. They work in very different disciplines. So I'm not working in one discipline, I'm working in many disciplines. They are at different stages in their academic careers. So some of them are first-year students, some of them are third or fourth or fifth-year students. And so they're at different stages. Most are exposed to academic genre in English regularly. So in their day-to-day academic lives, they're reading articles, they're attending lectures in English, et cetera, et cetera. Some have presented or published in English, depending on the stage in their career. All are under some pressure to present and publish in English. This, of course, is important because that means conference presentations and publishing research articles, or areas that they need to learn to communicate more effectively in English. For the methodology that I use in this course, borrowing from in particular for teaching writing. So today I'm going to focus on teaching writing, not focus on teaching presentation skills, but teaching academic writing. Borrowing on the sort of theoretical and methodological framework I've gone through before, we engage in discourse analysis. So we apply discourse analysis in the classroom, genre analysis, and we apply these especially to research articles when we're talking about writing. So it's a 40-hour course. We don't have time to talk about other genre of academic texts. So we tend to focus on the sections of research articles, so abstract, introduction, method section, etc. When it comes to abstracts, so going back to move theory, which I'll introduce again, I'll introduce more concretely in a moment. So IPMRD, so this is the general rhetorical structure of an abstract: introduction, purpose, methods, results, discussion. For introductions, we use the CARS model, which is very similar. It's also move theory of rhetorical structure. The CARS stands for creating a research space, and this is a framework developed by Swales, which sort of identifies the steps in writing an introduction, called moves. We also talk about reader-oriented style versus writer-oriented style and content-oriented style. Reader-oriented style is in English, generally speaking, if you look at, depending on the field of study, which we'll also talk about, authors of academic texts, authors of academic articles often adopt a reader-oriented style where they orientate themselves to the reader. They use signposting. They minimize jargon. They speak in a more conversational tone than often happens in other languages, which isn't always what's taught in the textbooks. Oftentimes textbooks teach you sort of this very formal academic style, but the studies that have actually looked at journal articles, the applied linguistic studies that have looked at journal articles, analyzed them, and collected data on them, have seen that they are much more informal than we like to teach oftentimes, depending on the field. And I apply this idea of a culture general approach. And that's, of course, because my students are coming from different disciplines. They come from different linguistic backgrounds. English is a lingua franca, so it is also low context. I'm not teaching them how to write academic research articles for Americans or for British. They have to learn how to write, to read and write research articles for an international audience because their academic communities are international. And so this involves cross-linguistic and cross-disciplinary analyses in the classroom. So we compare and contrast different disciplines and articles borrowed from different disciplines and from different languages. So typically English, German, and Italian. What I tell them at the beginning, each year that I teach this course, is that I cannot teach them how to write a research article in their discipline because I am not an expert in their field. This is a constant struggle of anyone working in ESP or English for specific academic purposes as well, that oftentimes we're not experts in their fields. So I can't teach them how to write a research article on economics or a research article on computer science per se, because I don't have a lifetime of experience reading those articles and writing those types of articles. But I can teach them how to apply genre analysis and discourse analysis to discover the conventions of their discipline on their own and the options that they have. So now, time permitting, great. I rushed through it, so I'm doing well. I'm going to really quickly go through a part of an example lesson. We're going to skip over some slides here, but I'm going to show you a little bit concretely how this goes, sort of draw it all together, what move analysis is, et cetera, et cetera. So when I introduce abstracts, I'll use something like this, usually in a handout form, sometimes as a slide, but I'll ask them what information is included in this abstract that you're about to see, and in what order. Intuitively, my students, because they're reading research articles on their own, intuitively, they already generally know what is expected in a research article abstract. And so I don't need to focus on this too much, but I will give them an abstract like this. And as you can see, we're not going to read this together, but this is one on pair and group work. I think it's collaborative writing. Yes, it's based on collaborative writing. So I'm taking something from my area of interest, in my area of expertise, so applied linguistics, language pedagogy, and I'm using it as a model, as an example for them. And they, of course, very quickly, they're able to identify this, making reference to their disciplines. They're able to tell me what the information is and what is included in the order, and in what order it's included. And then I ask them, sort of generally speaking, what do you expect in a research article abstract? What information is present and how is it generally structured? And we have a discussion about this. And this is when I introduce the idea of genre and genre analysis. So I tell them that an abstract belongs to a genre and follows certain rules, certain conventions. The specific purpose and the specific content are determined by the field or the author, the methods, the topic, etc. But the general purpose and the general content and the underlying structure are to a large extent determined by the genre itself, because we have these expectations of what occurs in a research article abstract as readers and as writers. And I introduced the concept of move theory. So in this case, I explained to them that moves are essentially steps that the author takes. It's the rhetorical structure of the text, the steps that the author takes for some communicative purpose. And in the case of a research article abstract, we have the introduction move, the purpose move, the methods move, the results move, and the discussion move. And this is the way I introduce it. And of course, immediately, if we look at the one that I gave, they immediately see there's no discussion move. So they're immediately seeing that there are options, that not everything always fits the rules that we teachers are presenting to them, because this one doesn't have a discussion move, it only has a results move. So they're already seeing that. Then I'll give them a task, something like this, to sort of practice this concept and build on it a little bit. So here they have a text, I think it's about research article abstracts. And what they have to do here is these moves, the 5 moves, all 5 are present, they have to put them into the correct order. So if you put them in the correct order, it looks something like this. So they work in groups, they discuss it. They're working in groups across disciplines as well. And none of them, very rarely, sometimes, but typically none of them are applied linguists or studying applied linguistics. And so this is all a foreign concept for them. The content is foreign to them. But generally speaking, they managed to put it in the correct order using the input that I've given them and the intuition that they've brought with them as PhD students who have read research article abstracts before. Another thing, so that, as I said, they generally understand intuitively. So they understand that there's an introduction, and some of them have been taught that explicitly in a more prescriptive manner. But one thing that they're interested in is sort of what these moves imply linguistically. So here we talk about tenses. So here's an example talking about tenses. So if we look at the examples that I've given them, and I tell them this is a very small sample size, we have 2 abstracts taken only from applied linguistics that I have intentionally picked myself, but using this small sample size that we have, doing our own genre analysis, these are the tenses that are used for introducing the topic. So we're using present simple for generalizations about the topic, and present perfect for talking about the research tradition, the consensus in the literature, and the gap in the literature that they are seeking to fill with their own research article. And so then I repeat this. We're going to skip over this, but you can see, so then talking about methods, oftentimes it's past simple for presenting results, also past simple, although when you're generalizing results, it's going to then be present simple. For discussing results, here we're again sort of generalizing, so we talk about, we use modal verbs in present simple. And then we build up to a task like this, where now they have to put this abstract, the moves in this abstract, in the correct order and pick the correct tense. But noting that they've been given options for each move, so they have some options here. And this is then a springboard for reflecting on what happens if we change the tense. What happens if we use the present simple here? Do we also have to use the present simple here? What happens if we change the tense from one move to the next? What happens if I choose the present simple instead of the simple past? How does that have a different impact on the reader, etc.? And so then these will be the correct solutions that are then presented to them. So that's generally how I introduce the concept of genre analysis, discourse analysis, and move theory as applied to research or article abstracts. The culture general dimension that comes into play here, which maybe you're already anticipating, is that first I start by modeling and introducing these concepts by analyzing an example from my field of study and praxis, so applied linguistics, language pedagogy. But then students bring an example of the same genre, whether it's an abstract, an introduction section, a method section, discussion section, from their field of study, and sometimes, time permitting, also from their first language, which is sometimes difficult in some fields because a field like computer science is English dominated, and a lot of them tell me they've never read anything in German or Italian in computer science, but they at least bring something from their field of study. First, they analyze that individually, and we use, sort of like with genre analysis, we code and we annotate, and I show them how to do that. And then they work in groups of mixed disciplines to compare, contrast, and discuss their analyses, focusing on the differences, the similarities and the differences across the examples that they brought to class. We discuss the reasons as a group, the reasons and effects of the differences across disciplines and across languages. So then we discuss this together. And then we repeat this throughout the course with other genre. So for instance, applying the CARS model, creating a research space model to introductions. So some of the example discoveries that sort of come out of this genre analysis during our lessons, just some examples, just looking at abstracts in particular, some of the things that the students and I collectively notice, and it's important to stress that I discover a lot during this process too, because again, I'm not experts in their field. And so it's always interesting for me to see how, for instance, an economics research article abstract is constructed. But oftentimes in the hard sciences, authors tend to make all 5 moves, while in the humanities, oftentimes authors skip 1 or 2. Which of course, again, contradicts what is taught in many introductory courses for PhD students, is what's often taught in EAP textbooks. We tell them, you always do all 5 moves or whatever, so it's always the structure. But in reality, if you look at it, there's some variation going on. Applied linguists, for example, like to vary tenses for each move. Not always, but there's a tendency that we vary the tenses for each move. And I think the reason we do this is, or the reason, what I've sort of understood as being the reason from our discussions in class, is that we do this because we're sort of reinforcing communication. We're identifying not only in terms of rhetorical structure and in terms of content, what the introduction is versus what the methods were versus what the implications might be in the future. We're also using tenses and other linguistic cues to signify to the reader the meaning that we want them to understand. English, especially in some fields, less so in others, tends to be more reader-oriented. So articles, research articles and abstracts as well, written in English, we tend to be more reader-oriented. We minimize jargon, we use signposting, etc., to make it more accessible and more readable. In German and Italian, especially in some fields, and also in English in some fields, it tends to be more content-oriented, where only an expert, not just an expert in economics, but an expert in, I don't know, econometrics used to apply to the Italian macroeconomy. So sort of like really niche fields within fields Oftentimes it's very content oriented, and it's only accessible to not just experts in the field in general, but the people who are experts on that specific topic. We also discover that some differences are imposed by the field genre, but differences also occur within fields and within genres. And this often has to do with the topics, as we discover, has to do with the topic of the research, the methods applied. So if you're applying quantitative versus qualitative methods or mixed methods, the voice that the author has developed over time, and the style that the author has applied to their writing. So all of these things can have an effect. So there are differences across authors, there are differences within fields. So some of the lessons learned for me and for the students. So students tend to gain the tools to analyze the types of genre they want or need to write. So they don't leave the course after 40 hours. Abstracts they get pretty good at, but writing a research article introduction would take a lot more. Becoming very proficient in writing research article introductions takes a lot more time than 40 hours. So they're not going to become native-like writers, because that's not the goal in the first place. But they are going to gain tools that they can then apply beyond the classroom as they continually try to discover how to approximate the genre that they want to write themselves, or that they need to write themselves. They develop some ability to comprehend research articles from other disciplines, because we're doing things across disciplines in the classroom. Importantly, they develop a recognition of the need to adapt writing for a specific audience. So knowing the difference between writing for specialists versus writing for generalists versus writing for non-experts, and also writing for, if you're writing for, even in English, for a predominantly Italian audience versus writing for an international audience. They become more aware of their readers. And they become more aware of the variance and conventions across and within disciplines, linguistic communities. The fact that there are many options out there, and that, importantly, getting back to this idea of non-essential cultures, that even within disciplines, there's lots of variance, that authors have choices too. You don't have to conform to the style and the structure that your PhD supervisor uses. You have many options out there. And if you apply genre analysis, you can discover many options that are equally appropriate and acceptable. So they have many options as writers, as they carve out their own voices and styles relative to the conventions of their fields and the conventions of their peers and their mentors. And the final thing is that they also, during the course, because we reflect on the role of English as a lingua franca in academia a lot during the course, and I continuously reassure them about that. They develop an understanding of how the dominance of English in academia has epistemological implications. So it affects not only, so for example, that it implies how they have to structure knowledge and present knowledge and present research findings, and how they have to go about research in the first place, because so many journals are English dominated. And if they want to get published, if they want to get more, not necessarily if they want to get published, but if they want to get cited and they want to get more recognition for their work, they're going to be more successful if they do it in English. And as we said before, for good or ill, so the good is it opens it up to an international audience, but the downside, of course, is it imposes English dominant conventions upon them. And also a lot of the English speaking journals, especially in some fields, tell them they have to structure the article in this way. They have to follow these conventions. They have to follow specific style guidelines, et cetera. So we reflect on this a lot as well. So that's, amazingly, brings me to the end of my presentation. I didn't think I was going to get it done with time for Q&A. But if you have any questions, I think Sarah will field those now.
We do have a question. We have a question in the Q&A. It's from a leader. It says, rules and norms in ELF. Can you tell us something more about that? For instance, some examples.
Oh, no, I cannot, because I do ESP and EAP, and I can tell you one thing, that unfortunately, the ELF perspective, world languages perspective somewhat, but ELF perspective, especially in EAP teaching, is not being adopted. It really is not being adopted. And that's because EAP, if you look at textbooks, if you look at a lot of the research, but in particular in praxis, it's not being adopted. We're still adopting sort of this monolingual model, and we're teaching towards these monolingual and perceived native speaker norms. I am not an expert on ELF. There are several, for instance, you can look at Jenkins and Seidelhofer's work. They've actually looked at how users of ELF communicate, and specifically how the grammar can be different, how the word choice can be different, how things are understood in different ways in those contexts. But I myself, I'm not prepared to give you sort of a list of examples of that. Also because when you look at academic writing, in most cases, and this is also somewhat unfortunate, but when you look at academic writing, when you're working with research articles, they go through a peer review process and they go through an editorial process whereby the authors, regardless of their backgrounds, they're forced to conform to these conventions. I've also had very negative experiences, I won't say which country, but publishing an article in a non-English dominant country. I had a negative experience because the editors were very obsessed with these perceived native speaker norms that you have to write in this particular structure, and you have to follow, for instance, this wasn't the style guide used, but the, what's it called? Which style guide for the applied linguistics? The applied linguistics style guide that the American applied linguistics style guide, that you have to apply that, to the T, that you can't vary from that at all. And that was a rather negative experience. So unfortunately, there's, depending on the journal, some journals I think are more accepting of variance away from what they perceive to be the native speaker norm. But generally speaking, in academic writing, unfortunately, people are forced to conform. But I think it's important. But I think it's important for, in particular, early career researchers and PhD students to be aware of this, and to be aware of the effect that it has on them, to be aware of the fact that they do have options, and that in reality, English for academic purposes in the real world, outside of publishing, especially if you go to conventions or something, is a lingua franca.
Okay. If there are any more questions, perhaps people could either pop them in the chat or in the Q&A. Wait a couple of minutes, see if anybody else has any other questions. I thought it was typical that the linguists have to show off their range of skills when they're working.
Yeah.
I'll tell my students that, because I teach to scientific English in medicine, and we have differences of opinion often. So I think I'll go back and say, well, you know why? It's because I'm a linguist.
Yeah.
That'll get them off the hook.
Well, it was interesting for me because I tend to have a lot of economic students, because the course is particularly popular with them. And it's true that the scholars in economics, if you look at their abstracts, it's all present simple. And the way I've explained this to them is, if you read it carefully, what the applied linguists they're referring to the research that has been completed. And so they're narrating a story. And this is something that applied linguists teach to PhD students and young academics, is that when you write up your research, you're telling the story of your research. And so they use these sort of narrative tenses, past, present, future. But the economists, what they seem to be doing is they are referring to the paper. So they're saying, and sometimes explicitly say, this paper describes, or this paper examines. And so they're referring directly to the paper, to the product, the research product that the reader is about to read. And so it's very interesting from a discourse perspective. And
yeah, fascinating, really. Okay. And maybe there's another question, possibly. Just a thank you.
Just a thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, if there's anything else, I think we can end the session there. So on behalf of TESOL Italy, I would like to thank Mike and all the participants for taking part in this session. I'll just say again that the certificates of attendance will be available to download from the convention page of the TESOL Italy website after the convention. And the next session will be at 5 p.m. and is the plenary with Thomas Farrell. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and thank you, Mike.
Bye, thank you.